Every single gun owner pulling a trigger in this country needs to wake up and look hard at the brass hitting the deck right now, because a massive political tectonic shift just completely leveled the establishment landscape down in Texas. For decades, the country club politicians sitting in air-conditioned Washington offices thought they could use your fundamental constitutional rights as a cheap bargaining chip. They figured they could cross the aisle, shake hands with anti-gun zealots, and sell out your liberty the exact second the mainstream media turned the high-pressure news cycle heat up to a boil. They operated under the arrogant assumption that everyday shooters would just fall in line like good little soldiers, blindly punch the ballot for anyone with a capital R stamped next to their name, and quietly swallow whatever watered-down compromise package they threw off the back of the political wagon. Well, the grassroots runoff primary results just slammed down from the Lone Star State. And the message from actual line-bound American gun owners is an absolute iron fist. The era of giving cheap, safe lip service to the Second Amendment while signing away our operational freedom behind closed doors is officially dead and buried. Out here where the rubber meets the road, people are done with the smooth-talking career politicians who talk tough during campaign season and then fold like cheap lawn chairs the moment they get inside the Beltway. The political calculation has changed permanently. An R next to a name is no longer a blank check for backroom negotiations, because the modern gun-owning electorate is highly educated, intensely focused, and actively enforcing strict accountability within its own party ranks. We need to do a heavy technical autopsy on the exact mechanism of this betrayal, because the breaking point for the grassroots base didn't happen overnight. It traces directly back to the year 2022, right after the horrific tragedy down in Uvalde, Texas. Now, let us establish the ironclad baseline truth here. Every decent, red-blooded American parent felt the absolute gut-wrenching horror of that day, and every sane individual out there wanted that naked evil stopped dead in its tracks. But while everyday citizens were broken with grief, the globalist establishment inside Washington did not mourn. They immediately saw a prime tactical opening to exploit raw human emotion and push highly restrictive federal gun control measures they have been drooling over for generations. And the man who stepped up to run point and quarterback those backroom negotiations with the most aggressive anti-gun Democrats in the Senate was Texas Senior Senator John Cornyn. He was the primary architect and lead negotiator for the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, a piece of federal overreach that never would have seen the light of day without his heavy internal arm twisting. Let us look at the actual gears inside that legislation that actively grind against the lawful gun owner. This compromise flooded the bureaucratic system with billions of taxpayer dollars specifically designed to bribe states into adopting unconstitutional red flag gun confiscation schemes. These systems completely bypass traditional due process, allowing weaponized agencies to seize property based on unsubstantiated claims before a citizen ever sets foot in a courtroom. Furthermore, it fundamentally altered the background check mechanism, turning a standard instant check into an arbitrary drawn-out holding period for younger, lawful American buyers aged 18 to 21. It forced an enhanced review process that operates as a de facto waiting period, delaying a citizen's immediate ability to procure defensive tools for their home. The establishment called it common sense, but out here on the firing line, we knew exactly what it was: a total surrender of fundamental liberties. The Bill of Rights does not contain a built-in escape clause for high-pressure situations, and it sure as hell does not take a backseat to an emotional national conversation driven by corporate newsrooms. That is precisely when constitutional protections matter the most, because a right that only exists when the political climate is perfectly calm is not a right at all. It is nothing more than a temporary, high-priced government permission slip. To fully comprehend why the traditional political establishment lost its decades-long grip on Texas, we must look deeper than mere election statistics. We must examine a fundamental, generational shift in the psychology of the American voter. For a long time, traditional politicians inside Washington believed that as long as they repeated standard pro-gun slogans during campaign season, the base would remain satisfied. But lip service is no longer a viable currency. Modern gun owners are no longer seeking passive representatives who engage in polite, defensive backroom maneuvers. They are demanding constitutional absolutists who view the right to keep and bear arms as an ironclad, non-negotiable barrier to government authority. This is precisely where the political strategy of Ken Paxton found its immense momentum. Instead of participating in the conventional country club culture of Washington accommodation, Paxton repositioned the office of the Texas Attorney General as an aggressive legal shield, demonstrating a willingness to use the court system as an offensive weapon against federal overreach. The grassroots base has grown highly sophisticated, moving far beyond generic political rhetoric. Shooters nationwide have witnessed federal bureaucracies consistently bypass the legislative process to enforce aggressive unilateral regulatory changes. They have watched as institutional forces extending from major banking corporations and credit card processors to technology giants attempt to implement backdoor surveillance and financial choke points on lawful, firearm-related commerce. In this high-stakes, asymmetric environment, the establishment's insistence on bipartisan solutions is no longer viewed as statesmanship. It is correctly identified as an incremental, inch-by-inch surrender of fundamental liberty. Rights do not exist to be bartered away during moments of heightened emotional or political pressure. They exist precisely to restrain the state when those emotions run high. The founders placed the Second Amendment immediately after the freedoms of speech, religion, and assembly because they recognized that an armed citizenry fundamentally alters the power dynamic between the government and the governed. By shifting the battleground away from compromising committee rooms directly into the federal courts, this new wave of constitutional populism has completely rewritten the tactical playbook, establishing a fierce precedent that rights can only be preserved when those in power genuinely fear the political consequences of infringement. The structural fallout of this Texas runoff election extends far beyond the borders of a single state. What happened here is not merely the defeat of one establishment figure or the success of one insurgent movement. It is the emergence of a completely new political risk model that every elected official in Washington must now calculate into their future decisions. For decades, the political class operated under a relatively predictable formula. A politician could campaign as a defender of constitutional rights, cast a controversial vote once in office, weather a few weeks of criticism, and then rely on party loyalty, donor networks, and media attention spans to carry them safely into the next election cycle. The assumption was simple. Voters have short memories, political organizations have long memories, and institutional support would always outweigh grassroots frustration. The Texas result has shattered that assumption. What makes this moment unique is not simply that voters were angry. Political anger is common. What makes it significant is that voters demonstrated a willingness to convert that anger into organized political action years after the original vote occurred. The legislation at the center of this controversy was passed in 2022, yet the political consequences remained alive long enough to influence a major statewide race years later. That fact alone sends a powerful signal through every congressional office in America. For elected officials, the traditional calendar of political accountability has suddenly expanded. A controversial vote is no longer something that disappears after a single news cycle. It can become a permanent part of a politician's public record, revisited repeatedly during future campaigns and amplified by activists who possess unprecedented access to digital communication networks. This reality is particularly unsettling for establishment Republicans who have historically relied on carefully balancing competing political interests. For years, many lawmakers attempted to position themselves as both defenders of gun rights and advocates of bipartisan compromise. They believed they could satisfy both constituencies simultaneously by supporting limited restrictions while continuing to use pro-Second Amendment rhetoric during campaign season. The Texas runoff suggests that strategy may no longer be sustainable. Across the country, elected officials are now witnessing a clear demonstration of what happens when a significant portion of the grassroots base concludes that rhetoric and voting records no longer align. The consequences are no longer theoretical. They are measurable, visible, and politically expensive. Perhaps the most important lesson extends beyond the Second Amendment itself. The broader message concerns trust. Voters are increasingly evaluating public officials through the lens of consistency rather than party affiliation alone. A growing number of citizens appear less interested in what politicians promise during election years and more interested in what they actually do when legislative pressure reaches its peak. This trend has the potential to reshape primary elections nationwide. Campaigns that once focused heavily on fundraising totals, establishment endorsements, and television advertising may now find themselves competing against a different force entirely. Highly motivated grassroots networks capable of organizing around a single issue for years at a time. Such networks do not require permission from party leadership, major donors, or national organizations. They operate independently, communicate rapidly, and maintain long institutional memories. As a result, political incumbency itself may be losing some of its traditional advantages. Holding office once provided lawmakers with enormous protection against internal party challenges. Name recognition, fundraising infrastructure, and establishment support often discouraged potential challengers before campaigns even began. Today, however, technology has dramatically lowered those barriers. Information spreads faster, activists organize more efficiently, and dissatisfied voters can coordinate on a scale that would have been unimaginable 20 years ago. For Washington insiders, this development represents a fundamental shift in the balance of political power. Influence is gradually moving away from centralized institutions and toward decentralized voter coalitions. Whether one views that change is positive or negative, its effects are becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The warning shot fired from Texas is therefore not aimed at a single senator, a single state, or even a single issue. It is aimed at an entire political culture that has long depended on the belief that voters eventually move on. Increasingly, they do not. The modern electorate has access to archives, voting records, legislative databases, interviews, speeches, and public statements that remain permanently available online. Every major decision leaves a digital trail, and every future election provides an opportunity for that trail to be examined once again. In this environment, political accountability becomes less dependent on media narratives and more dependent on documented facts. That reality is likely to influence decision-making inside Congress for years to come. Lawmakers who once viewed controversial votes as temporary storms may begin approaching them as permanent liabilities. The possibility of a future primary challenge no longer exists only on the horizon. It now exists in every legislative calculation made behind closed doors. Whether this marks the beginning of a lasting national realignment remains to be seen, but one conclusion is already difficult to dispute. The rules governing political survival are changing, and politicians across the country are being forced to adapt to a world in which the grassroots base possesses far greater influence than the establishment ever expected. Ultimately, the decisive outcome of this race leaves us with a fundamental question that extends far beyond the ballot boxes of Texas. Will this shift permanently alter how the political establishment in Washington calculates the risk of encroaching upon the Second Amendment? The answer depends entirely on the continuous vigilance of everyday citizens. This election has proven that the preservation of liberty does not rely on blind loyalty to political parties or charismatic figures, but on an unyielding allegiance to foundational principles. Politicians are merely temporary custodians of public authority, and they must be constantly reminded that their power is derived strictly from the consent of a governed population that refuses to see its rights diminished. The constitutional framework left by the founders remains intact only when the citizenry possesses both the literacy to understand their rights and the absolute resolve to defend them. An educated, armed populace fundamentally changes the dynamic of governance, serving as the ultimate check against the natural tendency of state power to expand. As we move forward into an uncertain political landscape, let the message of this realignment resonate clearly across the nation. The frontier of liberty is non-negotiable. Stand firm on the principles of the Constitution, enforce absolute accountability at every level of governance, and remember that freedom is never secured permanently. It is maintained daily through focus, dedication, and action. Stay vigilant, stay focused, and remain free.